Dear colleagues, I understand that we are all busy with preparations, so I'll try to be brief as possible. Besides, I also lack time for preparation, so don't be strict on the content. So the topic is really interesting, and Kazakhstan, as you would see in the presentation, did a lot in terms of military doctrinal documents, and in my presentation I would like to present some general information about Kazakhstan's military affairs, tell you about the evolution of our military doctrine, briefly analyze the new military doctrine, and then I would be happy to take your questions. So, as you know, Kazakhstan was forced to create independent army in May 1992 because the initial arrangement was to keep the collective army, the CIS army, but then after Russia decided to create its independent army, it became obvious that Kazakhstan has to create its own army. So in May 1992, President Nazarbayev issued an edict creating the National Armed Forces. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we inherited quite a large army, amounting to almost 200,000 personnel, thousands of tanks, aircraft, but it was not in our economic capacity to maintain such a huge army, and it was of course natural that we had to cut it, especially in the very difficult 1990s. So currently our active military personnel, according to some sources, is about 70,000 people. But again, this is confidential information. I mean, it's prohibited by law to make public numbers of military forces, of internal troops, and so on. So these are estimates by the military strength ranking, by the global power index.
Firepower?
Firepower. Yes. So, according to this ranking, Kazakhstan ranks 55th out of 133 countries. So you can compare with some of our neighbors, Russia obviously, and China. They are second and third. Iran and Uzbekistan are ahead of us, but we are ahead of Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and other Central Asian neighbors. And as you could see, our defense spending stands at about $2.5 billion. This includes not only military or defense budget, but also spending on military procurement, on military training, and so on. This is a graphic made on this some available statistics as of 2015. It's in Russian, but I mean, here you can see that Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, so 5 states in terms of population, in terms of military power, and some other types of armaments. You could see that we have some advantage over Uzbekistan in terms of military personnel, but it's together with reserves, and I don't think it's a reliable number, because the Uzbek army, I think, stronger than ours, and both in terms of numbers and in terms of armaments.
So the first one is population. The second one is
armed forces plus reserves.
Plus reserves.
Then artillery, aircraft, tanks, military ships.
Aircraft is Samo.
Samolyoti, right?
Okay, 200. You have 200, more than 200 aircraft.
Yeah, but you should also take into account that, that not all of them are modern aircraft.
I see.
We have some outdated ones.
Okay. And the last one there, Brunet?
It's armored vehicles.
Okay.
And then rocket launches, probably. Rocket was not, it's a rocket.
Rockets.
Yeah.
Missiles.
Missiles or something.
And then the
It's ships.
ships. Okay.
So you see Uzbekistan has none.
Oh yeah.
As well as Tajikistan and Kazakhstan.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, so since 2001, our armed forces, they are under the command of the Chief of the General Staff. So the minister is a political appointee who directs the ministry, defines the strategic directions, but the actual military command belongs to the Chief of the General Staff. It was also decided in 2002 that Kazakhstan's military budget should not be less than 1% of our GDP. Our armed forces, we have three branches: ground forces, air defense forces, naval forces, and air assault or air mobile forces and rocket forces. They are part of ground forces, but they also serve as independent components of the armed forces. We have four regional commands. They are called Astana, with the headquarters based in Karaganda, East based in Semey, West in Atyrau, and South in Taraz. In terms of military education, National University of Defense, it was transformed from the Military Academy of the Armed Forces, and it is located in Astana. So my purpose was to look at the evolution of Kazakhstan's military doctrine, and I'm in the beginning of my research. I would like to look at how Kazakhstan's military thought developed, why it developed in the way it developed, and what factors influenced it, and so on. So here I'm just presenting my initial findings, so it's nothing very profound. So military doctrine, as you probably know, it's a document which outlines the state's view on military security and defense. So in such documents, they are called differently in different states. So in some states they are called defense doctrine, in some states they are called national security strategy, and so on. So in the document, the state identifies existing and potential threats to its security. It identifies ways of addressing these threats, how to prevent wars, armed conflicts, and also the doctrine describes directions of the development of Kazakhstan's military capabilities. So the primary goal of Kazakhstan is to create well-equipped and highly mobile armed forces, which are capable of protecting Kazakhstan's vital national interests from existing and potential military threats, and also fulfill Kazakhstan's international obligations. As you know, we are members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and as such, we are mandated to come to assist our allies. So, Kazakhstan probably is the one and only state in the former Soviet Union which had so many military doctrines during its independence. The current one is our fifth doctrine. For example, Uzbekistan, it only had two, I guess. Our first doctrine was adopted in 1993, and of course it followed the steps of the Soviet Union in some sense, because it was talking about some bipolar world and its transfer to the multipolar order. It was talking about the nuclear war and so on. But unfortunately, I couldn't find the actual text of the first doctrine, so I just read the accounts about it. So as you could see, it was based more on former Soviet military provisions and principles. But then, as you could see, we adopted 4 more military doctrines in 2000, 2007, 2011, and 2017. So, on average, in each 7 years, we adopted a new military doctrine. So here in this table, I tried to summarize why our military doctrine was updated so often. So each doctrine contains reasons for why we need to update. So Sometimes they are probably similar, but for example, in 2000, there was a statement that there are some changes in our geopolitical environment, and if you recall that time, in 1998, India and Pakistan joined the ranks of nuclear powers. There was some escalation in the Middle East, as always, in Afghanistan, the emergence of Taliban, and so on. So probably those were the factors that necessitated the need for a new doctrine. And also, the 1993 doctrine was, as I said, the first post-Soviet one, so there was some transformation in Kazakhstan's society and economy, so we needed to adopt a doctrine that was more relevant. In 2007, the priority aim was announced as the creation of a professional army capable of rapid deployment. There was also a referral to the socio-economic and political modernization of Kazakhstan society, whatever it means. And also, of course, 2007, it is the environment after September 11th, the US involvement in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so on. Therefore, of course, we had the presence of Western forces in the region. Those were some reasons for updating the doctrine.
I think the second point in 2007 is related to the maybe revolutions happening.
Yes, as well, of course. I will tell about this in the threats section. In 2011, as you could see, aggravation of the military political situation in the world and in the region, technological progress and improvement of warfare forms and methods, and in the third, you could see asymmetric actions of destructive forces. So there was some reference to such forms of unusual forms, non-traditional forms of military warfare. And again, in 2017, the new doctrine, here we could see a reference to rising confrontation between global and regional powers, increased role of military power in solving interests and interstate and interstate conflicts, low effectiveness of international law, and in the doctrine you could also see the mentioning of certain countries' aspirations to change the existing world order. So it doesn't identify which state, so we can only guess, are we referring to Russia or are we referring to the States, or both of them. So anyway.
So this, the other one, the previous one was your compilation, right? Or
you mean which one?
The previous slide.
This one?
This one, yeah, reasons for update.
Oh yes.
Your compilation from the doctrines.
From the
doctrine papers, yeah, it's a very nice, I think, compilation, yeah. And these are
yes,
the same.
yeah, I will not focus on all of them, but as you could see in all the previous doctrines, as I said, I don't have the 1993 text, but the previous ones, they all listed divided threats into external and internal. So as Abdullah rightly noted, some of them are indeed related to the upheavals in our neighbors. For example, in 2007, the first one says political instability in neighboring countries, which is an obvious referral to events in Kyrgyzstan and Andijan in Uzbekistan.
Is there any study like this in the literature? Did you have come up with?
No. This is what I made this morning. Just.
Okay, but this is a very good. I think this could be a good contribution.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what I want to analyze.
Very nice.
So I will not focus on all of this. Let me just pass to. And here, another interesting thing, priority directions of military cooperation. Just to compare, for example, in 2000 we mentioned certain states like, well, Russia, United States, they are always present, but also Turkey, Germany in 2000. But then we don't mention Turkey or Germany. So you also see some change in the priorities. You see, if, well, CSTO is always up front. But for example, in 2011, we didn't mention CSTO first, but we mentioned strengthening trust and openness in the military field in the region, strengthening of WMD non-proliferation regimes. In our current doctrine, we don't mention any states by name. We just mention that we would like to develop our unified regional air defense together with the Russian Federation. We also say that we would like to participate in joint exercise with the CSTO, STO, and NATO. We would like to strengthen our cooperation with the United Nations and OSCE. So it's also interesting to compare how differently emphasis was put in different doctrines. So what is new in our new military doctrine? Does it signal some shift in Kazakhstan's strategic thinking, or is it just a reflection of our ambiguity or multi-vector foreign policy? So it remains a matter of research. But what is interesting, for the first time we mentioned hybrid warfare methods. So for some observers, it's a clear reference to Ukraine and Russia's interference in the Ukrainian affairs. But for some experts, it's a reference to the Western interference in the Arab states, for example. So it might be both, of course. But still, it's quite interesting that we mention this and we say that foreign powers or even groups of people, they may want to destabilize Kazakhstan by using not only military means but also some, for example, cyber means and other information attacks and so on. In 2014, the internal troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs was transformed into territorial defense units, or the so-called National Guard. It's interesting that it is mentioned in the military doctrine because it means that in case of some internal instability, National Guard would be the first. Well, it was always been, but the fact that it is mentioned in the military doctrine means that the role of the National Guard is increasing. And as I said, there is no separation between internal and external threats. Another interesting thing that is mentioned in the doctrine that we plan to create the National Center for Defense Management. It's a clear copy. We are copying the Russian experience here because they already have such a center, and this is the need for such center is attributed to the increasing demand for improving our mobilization capabilities. The doctrine also mentions that in our Ministry of Defense and other security services, some cybersecurity units were created. And it is also important because, as I mentioned, as part of hybrid warfare, cyber threats are quite challenging. It's also interesting that the military doctrine mentions, and this was also mentioned in the previous doctrine, but this doctrine specifies that joint enterprises should be created on the territory of Kazakhstan in order to help rearm our armed forces and to produce advanced weapons systems. And in his speeches, President Nazarbayev, he gave a task to increase the domestic content, the so-called domestic content in their armaments production to 80%. But it's quite an ambitious goal, so it remains to be seen if we'll be able to reach such a percentage. So all our military doctrines, they are defensive in nature. We declare no first use of force, but we also say that if non-military means of solving the conflict are not effective, we reserve the right to use military force. So the three main tasks that we put before ourselves, I mean our Ministry of Defense, is to maintain combat readiness of the armed forces, and in the doctrine we list the measures are listed which are needed to be taken. It also says about maintaining mobilization readiness of the state. It also includes training of the population, increasing the capacity of the reserve force, and so on, so all sorts of things. Doctrine also pays some attention to expanding Kazakhstan's participation in the peacekeeping operations, meaning both collective security under the CSTO umbrella and also peacekeeping missions under the UN aegis. You may know that, and I also wrote about it in my e-bulletin on Kazakhstan and Partnership for Peace program, that we've created the Kazbrik force, which consists of 3 battalions, and one of them is specifically for cooperation with the United Nations, one is for cooperation with the CSTO forces, and one is as a reserve. So Kazakhstan pays quite a high attention to this issue, and it was also declared as one of our priorities in our UN chairmanship, UN Security Council chairmanship. We also have sent a number of military officers in the UN missions all over the world. We also host the NATO training center in Almaty, and which serves to train not only Kazakh officers but also officers from the region. And in conclusion, well, Russia of course remains our closest ally, but Kazakhstan needs continued cooperation with primarily with the West, with the United States, to maintain this strategic balance of power in the region, and probably to promote regional integration in Central Asia. While we are members of the perceived anti-Western blocs such as the CSTO and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, nevertheless we try to diversify our military links, and we try to cooperate with the United States and others. And another conclusion that I made is that, well, whether we want it or not, political transition in Kazakhstan is inevitable, and you can see many forecasts saying that Kazakhstan may turn unstable if certain conditions are met, and that there are forces which are interested in destabilizing Kazakhstan. So probably it is in our best interest to keep our armed forces in higher readiness, at the same time trying to mitigate the consequences of political transitions. So I hope that we will be able to pass through this stage as safely as possible.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your attention.